Hello and welcome to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Institute is one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary exploration. We bring students, scholars, artists, and practitioners together to pursue curiosity-driven research, expand human understanding, and grapple with questions that demand insights from across disciplines. You can be part of this vibrant community by attending public programs such as this one, visiting exhibitions, or pursuing the special collection held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more, you can visit radcliffe.harvard.edu and sign up to receive more information on news and events. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Professor Héctor Tobar. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use your Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. Now it is my pleasure to introduce this year's Lillian Galley Knaffel Fellow, Héctor Tobar. He is a novelist, journalist, and associate professor of literary journalism and Chicano Latino studies at the University of California, Irvine. Professor Tobar is the author of 5 books, including the novels The Last Great Road Bum, The Barbarian Nurseries, and The Tattooed Soldier. His nonfiction book, Deep Down Dark, The Untold Stories of 33 Men Buried in a Chilean Mine and the Miracle That Set Them Free, tells the story of 33 men who spent 69 days buried in a collapsed Chilean mine in 2010. The book was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, as well as a New York Times bestseller. Additionally, the book was adapted into a film, The 33, starring Antonio Banderas. Professor Tobar's work has been published in 15 languages. He is a contributing writer for the New York Times, Opinion Pages, and his work has also appeared in the New Yorker and the Los Angeles Times. His nonfiction has been featured in Best American Short Stories 2016, LA Noir, Ziziva, and Slate. Professor Tobar received his MFA from the University of California, Irvine, and he was born in Los Angeles to Guatemalan immigrants. At Radcliffe, Professor Tobar is working on a nonfiction book, The Sisyphus Project, reflecting the deep changes in American culture as a result of anti-immigrant rhetoric and the nativist movement. The US-Mexico border wall has garnered much attention in the past few years, but many prior administrations have built and expanded the border wall. In the mid-1990s, during the Clinton administration, a new barrier was erected along the border with California. The border fence is correlated with an increasing sense of nativism in the US. The Sisyphus Project aims to better understand the border wall within the larger context of US history. Tobar will examine how a century of immigration policy and the evolving image of the alien in the US culture has shaped American ideas of racial identity and what it means to be white. The project will also consider how Americans with Latin American roots are simultaneously forming a collective identity created from narrative of empire, migration, and inequality. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Héctor Tobar.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Claudia, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much to Harvard and to Radcliffe for including me in your family in this academic year. And thank you to the Lillian Galley Knaffel family for sponsoring my fellowship this year. It's just a great honor to be here and to be able to give this talk. My project is called the Sisyphus Project, or Migrants Light, and it's sort of a continuation of the themes that I've explored in my work over 20 years, 25 years of being a writer and a journalist, right? All my books have been very, very political. And I've written 3 novels that deal with various aspects of racial injustice, violence, and resistance. I have 2 books of nonfiction that are about Latino working people and about listening to Latino working people. And I was a journalist for more than 25 years, and I've conducted several thousand interviews. And so my new project, if we can have the next slide, my new project is really about the themes that have dominated the Latino experience in the last 20 years, right? Which is that we live in this age of intolerance and xenophobia, right? Of the horrors that have been inflicted on immigrant bodies. We've all seen those images of immigrant people in detention, right? And of course, the wall is the symbol, right, of this new age, this age in which Latino people are really cut off from their roots, right, by this policy of enforcement, right, strict enforcement of immigration laws. So can we have the next slide? And so the premise behind my book is really that there is this generation of young people of Latin American descent who are growing up longing to understand the systems that foment prejudice and exploitation, right? And to use language and knowledge as tools of resistance and social transformation. Um, I have this experience because this premise comes to me because I'm a professor, right? And I've in constant contact with university students, and I really feel the need to create a work for them, create a work for this generation. So can I have the next slide? And so the mission of my book is to create a work of literary prose that speaks to this moment and that tackles the meaning of Latino or Latinx and Hispanic in United States history. Next slide. And so I have three works that I'd like to highlight as inspirations to this project. First is the great 1963 book by the African-American essayist and novelist and speaker James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, in which Baldwin explores what it means to be African-American in the early 1960s, really reflecting on his own experience as a young man growing up in the 1930s and 40s in Harlem. A really powerful work of prose, really just absolutely moving. Perhaps for me, one of the greatest books ever written about race in the United States. The second book is a book that many of you may not have heard of. In Spanish, it's called Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina, or The Open Veins of Latin America. And it's by the Uruguayan poet Eduardo Galeano. And this is essentially um, a, um, a kind of like popularization of Latin American economic history and the history of empire and exploitation in Latin America. It was a very, very important book for me when I was an undergraduate, and for an entire generation of Latin American radicals. It was sort of their introduction to the idea of empire as this force shaping Latin American history. And the third thinker is the amazing Ida B. Wells, the 19th century journalist and writer who really uh, sort of deconstructed the lies and the secrets behind the epidemic of lynching and anti-Black violence of her time. Just a really ferocious writer. And so Ida B. Wells is definitely inspiration. Next slide, please. So I'm really fortunate that I'm a professor at University of California, Irvine, which is a Latino serving institution, which means we have about 40% of our student body is actually of Hispanic descent, right? And so I've been there for 3 years, and every year I teach 2 and sometimes 3 large lecture classes with about 80 to 200 students each. And in each, since I'm a writer, and really that's basically the only thing that I know is to be a writer, every class I give the students a writing assignment, a creative nonfiction writing assignment. And it's basically just tell me a story about the Latino and Latinx experience, right? And I get stories from, my students are both Latino and non-Latino, but I get these stories about Latino life in California, in the United States, right, in our times. And for me, this collection of letters has become a kind of archive of the Latino present, right? There are these amazing stories about what it's like to be or to live in or next to a Latino community in the 21st century. Can I have the next slide? There we go. So here's an excerpt from one of the stories, just a couple of sentences from a story. This one is written by a young woman of Mexican descent. Her mom is a street vendor. Her mom begins her life in the United States as a young woman selling tacos on the street, and eventually builds up her savings because this woman, this mom, is an incredible, she's a savant, is the way her daughter puts it. She's a savant with numbers. And so the daughter wrote for me in my class My mom loved to play poker and would take us to the park to do so. She took only $10 for chucherias, which is a Mexican slang word for snacks. And after 2 hours of play with the abuelos, she would walk home with my siblings and I and her $90 profit, right? And so this is part of a very long story about how her mother becomes essentially wealthy. Her mother, who arrives in the United States with almost nothing from Mexico, uses her just incredible mathematic wizardry to parlay her small poker winnings and her profits as a taco vendor into a business that eventually, she owns a horse ranch. They own a horse ranch now in the suburbs of LA. And so this is a very, very wonderful story. And I just so many of them like this about immigrant success or immigrant labor. So can I have the next slide, please? So this one is from a Salvadoran immigrant woman whose father committed suicide when she was 11 years old. And she writes, "My father did not intend to be a bad man. He believed in the goodness of people. But while he fought for the freedom of his people during the Salvadoran Civil War, he could not fight for his own freedom away from the alcohol, abuse, and drugs that would follow." So this young woman at the age of 11 actually discovered her father's body. He committed suicide in their apartment. And an incredibly traumatic event, but really just part of a larger story of her life, right? Because this woman, young woman, puts together her life again after this traumatic event. And of course, so many of these stories from these children of immigrants or immigrants themselves are filled with traumatic moments. But at the same time, there's this incredible richness to the narratives. And I really feel when I'm reading their stories that there's a richness there that's not in American literature about Latino people. And also, I have to say, in a lot of Latino literature by Latino writers, right? I just, it's this incredible complexity. And so to me, it feels like I'm looking into the future of American literature, right? Because all of them are very young writers. Not, only a very small, very small portion of them are going to become writers. Because it takes like a generation to make a writer, right? It takes a generation to break down the walls to publishing and all that, right? And so I feel like I'm reading the future August Wilsons or Arthur Millers or Virginia Woolfs of the United States, right? The themes of their work. So can I have the next slide? So following Baldwin's inspiration, I felt that I was writing to this new generation of writers and thinkers. And so I began, "You wrote words for me to read, a string of memories that placed me inside the eyes of the child you were." That is for now the opening to my next book project. If I could have the next slide, please. A daughter of Honduras, of Mexico, and of the Central Valley of California, with its flat, dry plains covered with crops and cows, and towns filled with paisas and their chickens. So a paisa is a Mexican Californian slang word for countryman or for a person from the old country, right? And so this is a conflation of many different people that I'm sort of describing these people writing to me. If I could have the next slide, please. You wrote, "I am having a nervous breakdown, but your precise and controlled prose belied this." So that sentence, "I am having a nervous breakdown," was written for me by a student who is Honduran Mexican. And she had written a piece in which she had described, and also come to my office to describe an event in which she had been abused as a 5-year-old and how this event had marked her life. But she was the antithesis of the victim when you met her in person. When you meet her in person, she's the antithesis of the victim. She's this ferocious, brave writer at 20 years old, right? And her prose was indeed precise and controlled, right? Have the next slide, please. So I tell these students, "Tell me a story about the Latino experience," right? But what is Latino in the first place, right? So allegedly, we're one of the 5 major ethnic groups in this country. And the way that these ethnic and racial groups are derived is that the census asks us first, "Are you of Hispanic heritage?" And you answer yes or no in the census. And then they ask you, "What race are you?" And you pick white, black, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, etc. Right? And so the media has taken these five major groups. They've conflated the two questions to create these five major groups. And I'm supposed to fit in this pie called Latino, which is a pan ethnicity, right? Many different kinds of ethnic groups are grouped together in this slice of pie called Hispanic or Latino. And in fact, after thinking about this for a long time, I realized that all all ethnic categories are pan ethnicities. All racial categories are pan ethnicities, right? Obviously, Native American is, Asian is as well, right? So all of these different categories are pan ethnicities, and I'm supposed to fit in Latino. Okay, can I have the next slide? But if I ask my students, right, well, what are you? That's the sort of annoying question, which is meant to prompt the response of your ethnic or racial group, right? They never answer I'm Latino. It's very rare for a Latino person to sort of, among Latino people especially, to identify as Latino. Instead, they'll answer, well, I'm Mexican American, or I'm Mexican, or I'm Mexicano, right? If they're sort of into the whole Spanish thing. Or they might say, because many people are sort of mixed heritage, something like, my dad is Mexican and my mom is Guatemalan. Several times I've had students who, their primary identification is something like, I'm from South Central. Now, when you say in the West, because when I was in Oregon, I had some students from LA who would tell me I'm from South Central. That's like an announcement of being from a community of tough and striving people, right? Because that means you grew up among Black people, right? When you say I'm from South Central, and you're proud of that. You're proud of that fact. So that to me is a major identifier for a lot of people, statements like that. Or they might say, I'm Zapotec, my family is from Oaxaca, right? So that really makes you technically Mexican, but Zapotec is this indigenous identity. And so people feel the indigeneity stronger than anything. And so they'll say, I'm Zapotec. Or I'm New Yorican, which is a New Yorker who's Puerto Rican, right? Soy Catracho, I am Catracho. Catracho is a Honduran. Chilango is a person from Mexico City. Chilangos, very proud people. I lived in Mexico City, and I can tell you, Chilangos are very proud. Or Tejano, somebody from Texas. Spanish is what people often say in New Mexico because they are indeed descended from Spaniards, right? Never have been immigrants in this country. And so, or finally, Blaxican. I have students who are Blaxicans. They are Black and Mexican, right? So next slide, please. So why do we even use Latino, right? Well, there is a usage of Latino that goes back to the 19th and 18th centuries, these first sort of colonial contacts, and then later after the US war, where people called themselves Latino Americanos or Hispano Americanos. But really the modern usage of Latino takes root in the middle of the 20th century. And it follows, it comes in about the 1980s. In the 1980, the census introduced the term Hispanic on the question about Hispanic identity on the census form in response to these, very powerful movements of Mexican American and Puerto Rican activists. There on the slide, you see an image of the Young Lords, right? Who were a group very active in Chicago and New York of Puerto Rican nationalist Puerto Rican activists, right? And so, so the Census Bureau, the government, in response to this movement of Latino people, decides, well, we need to sort of consider this as a separate race ethnicity problem from the whole white-black question. So they include this question on the census in 1980. About the same time, Puerto Rican and Mexican activists are starting to form alliances in Chicago and other cities where these two different strands of Latino migration merge. And they start calling themselves Latino to pursue housing rights or to pursue employment rights, right? And then also at about that same time, migration from Central America and South America increases dramatically, from Guatemala, from El Salvador, from Colombia, later from Ecuador and Peru, right? And so you have all these relationships starting between Latino peoples, between Peruvians and Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Ecuadorians. And so Latino reflects this sort of mixing of these Spanish-speaking peoples. And finally, of course, like everything else, it's appropriated by marketing and media people. And so, the Spanish language network sort of latches onto this term Latino and begins using it. And so the term spreads, right? Can I have a next slide, please? Now, so Latino and Hispanic are supposedly ethnic categories, right? But throughout US history, Latino identity, and especially Mexican identity, has been racialized. In fact, Mexican was a race category in the 1930 census, which is a reflection of these prejudices that go back, right, to the conquest of, in the US-Mexican War. But that really become, sort of a feature of the life of the Southwest in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. This sign is probably from somewhere around 1940 in Dallas, Texas, a sign that says no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans, right? Sort of imposing that idea of segregation from the Old South into the Southwest and adding Mexican as this category, right? So Mexican is a category that's been racialized in many ways. Can I have the next slide, please? But all race categories really are a fiction, right? They're created by the collisions of empire, capital, and human lives, right? Part of my book is to decode this, untangle this history for my readers by explaining the origins of these crazy terms like Caucasian, right? They're terms that are so crazy, a lot of us don't even really fit in them, okay? So, so this, for example, this is my birth certificate from 1963, Los Angeles County, where they still put race on the birth certificates. And it lists as the race of my mother, Caucasian, and it lists the race of my father as Caucasian, right? Now, my mother is could be as a white passing person, except when you hear her accent, which always gives her away, her accent in English, but she's a very fair-skinned person. My father is not. His mother was, I'm almost certain, a Mam Mayan Indian. My father's a dark, a sort of cinnamon colored person, like I am. And so to me, this reflects the confusion, sort of this in-between state at that particular moment that Latino people had in the whole sort of US racial hierarchy, right? And so there's always been this ambiguity and confusion about where Latino people fit into the racial scheme of the country. Can I have the next slide, please? So Latinos themselves have this sort of attraction and repulsion from the term white. Now, the most famous desegregation case in Mexican-American Latino history is a 1947 case, Mendez versus Westminster, which was commemorated in a US postage stamp, which you can see here, the top stamp, Mendez versus Westminster. Now, in that case, a group of Mexican-American activists and parents argued that Mexican-American children should not be segregated separately from white children because Mexican people are white, right? So it's this sort of, argument to accept this racial category and say, no, we're white. We're not Black people. We should not be segregated. They won their case, but not because of that argument. The judge found that the 13th, the sort of the Reconstruction Amendments of the Constitution, the 13th Amendment applied, the 14th Amendment applied, right? The Equal Protection Clause, I think, is what applied in this case. And so, but the parents themselves argued we're white. Now, on the other side of the coin, and in another postage stamp, this one is of Ruben Salazar, who was a Mexican-American columnist for the Los Angeles Times. And in that newspaper, he embraced the critique of whiteness that the Chicano movement, which was the name that the Mexican-American movement adopted in the 1970s, the Chicano movement, he embraced that critique by saying a Chicano is a Mexican-American with a non-Anglo vision of himself. Okay, so next slide, please. Now today, right, in the US, Mexican is, and Latino and especially Mexican are terms that are becoming racialized, right? We know that race is a fiction, race has no basis in biology, but race is this idea that there are things inherently that separate groups of people, right? And the idea of race has been the basis of so many hateful and violently, horrible ideas, throughout history. And so Latino is being racialized into this idea that equals barbarism, servility, criminality, right, and passivity. And the wall has become another element in defining that identity, right? White privilege means that you live on this side of the wall. It means that you need a wall. It means that you need somebody like Donald Trump to help you build the wall to protect you, right? That to me is what, so the wall is really redefining what whiteness is. Can I have the next slide, please? And you can see this in film. You can see this in many, many films, and especially that new genre called the cartel drama, right? And so to me, having seen many of these dramas, and some of them are, of course, very, very good, this particular movie is The Mule by Clint Eastwood in 2019. And so in many of these films, and especially in The Mule, the cartels are symbols of the desires of white people. And so the white sort of writer is projecting his own sort of the desires and the of his of the moment onto these Latino people, right? So Clint Eastwood goes to a cartel hangout, has all these sort of beauties sort of on him, and then he's got all this cash, right? Um, so the cartels are kind of a stand-in for this angst, right, that exists in white America. And in almost all of these cartel dramas, including the best one of all, Breaking Bad, considered to be the best television show, right, of the 21st century so far. The cartels, this drug money, is really a symbol of hypercapitalism. So there's really allegories about what it's like to be an American in an age of hypercapitalism and the decay of the family. So people are projecting, right, all of this onto Latino people. Can I have the next slide, please? And so the other side of this coin is in this Quentin Tarantino film, and in fact, in many Quentin Tarantino films, Latinos are inconsequential backdrops, right, to the pathos and the drama of white people. So in the film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the Leonardo DiCaprio character leaves Musso's and Frank's weeping because his career is falling apart, and the Brad Pitt character, tells him, "Don't cry in front of the Mexicans," because they're getting their car, and the Mexican valets, supposedly Mexican valets, are giving them their keys. Now, this really irks me because my father was a valet in Hollywood in about that same time period, and he wore that same red outfit, when he worked. And so, so to Quentin Tarantino, a native, an Angelino, raised in Los Angeles, who grew up among Latino people, he's using what he knows to make fun of us, essentially, to make a joke. Okay, that's part of what goes on with the image of Latino people in the media. Can the next slide, please? So the illusion, so Latino labor in Los Angeles is really the foundation of the city, right? That valet you saw parking the car, he's part of an army of service people, of construction workers, etc., who build the city, right? And they create this image of order and efficiency in the United States, and especially in cities with large Latino populations like Los Angeles or San Francisco. Can I have the next slide? So the illusion of white power, white authority in the suburbs comes from erasing the Latino labor from that picture. Because if you look at that picture of perfection, really it's built by Latino construction workers. It's kept orderly by Latino gardeners. The children are taken care of by Latino nannies, probably Central American nannies, right? And so that erasure creates this illusion of power, right? It creates this illusion of authority. Okay. Can you go to the next slide, please? At the same time, Latino workers, they spend their whole day creating this order, creating the perfect suburb, creating the clean office, picking the crops, creating the sort of, what we need to have this, wonderful society that we live in. And so it's like rolling up a hill. They are like Sisyphus. And that's where the idea of the Sisyphus project comes from, is they're rolling the boulder up the hill, but they never get to complete this work and enjoy the fruits of the labor, because the boulder always rolls back down, right? And they go back to where they live, because Latino labor is increasingly marginalized and it's become a caste. There are 11 million people who are undocumented in this country. They have no route to US citizenship. They have many of the pathways of class mobility are denied to them, right? And so it's a Sisyphean labor, right? That Latino labor. That's where the idea of the Sisyphus project comes from. And the next slide, please. And so what I want to say, and I'll just read the slide, is that privileged whiteness is an illusion of efficiency and mastery of one's surroundings. And this illusion is created by the erasure of the labor of colonized peoples from the story of the United States. Can I have the next slide, please? So, as James Baldwin put it, white is a metaphor for power, right? I can't think of a quote that better summarizes, right? Um, so this erasure of Latino people sort of creates this illusion of white authority, and when white is a metaphor for power. Next slide, please. So then what is Latino? If we think of it in terms of power, what is Latino? Well, for me, Latino is a story about empire. And Latino and Latinx describe a group of people living an imperial epic, right? Latino people are brown, black, white, indigenous, European, Asian, and African. They're Jews and Gentiles. Some of us speak Spanish and some of us don't. But all of us have roots. All of us have a family story in the poverty and upheavals of shifting borders created by United States imperialism, right? If you think of Mexico, think of Mexican history, the way US capital has shaped Mexican society. In Central America, various interventions doomed the liberal democratic project. In El Salvador, in Guatemala, um, if you think about Cuba and Puerto Rico and how their histories were shaped by the Spanish-American War, right? So, or even if you're New Mexican, if you're from, Santa Fe, New Mexico, your history was shaped by both the Spanish Empire and the American Empire and the conquest, right? So Latino to me is a story about empire. Can the next slide, please? And so our Latino lives exist within this empire. I have a slide here of my father in Guatemala City, member of the Guatemalan army. 4 years after a military coup overthrew the democratic government of Guatemala, my father joined the army in hopes of getting an education. Um, and then 3 years later, he brings his pregnant wife and his unborn child to Los Angeles, to the other side of the empire, right? From the periphery, the hinterlands of the empire, to the very, to an imperial capital, because Los Angeles, this is me, that's me in my mother's lap in 1963. And I think this photograph is sort of my father sort of sending this back home to Guatemala, saying, look, we made it. Here we are. We're in the center of everything. We're in the imperial capital. Now, behind this, there's a story. Behind that photograph is a story that's very common in Latino families. And I know this because, like I said, I'm reading hundreds of student stories by Latino students every year. And that's that I was conceived out of wedlock, right? My parents, conceived me when they were in their early 20s. When they arrived, my father was 21 and my mother was 20, right? And so this is a theme that comes up again and again in the work of Latino students today, is that, oh my God, I'm the product of this dysfunction, of this chaos, right? Of this youth. And so to me, I want to embrace that as part of our story instead of being ashamed for it. And so that's why I wrote what comes next. Can I have the next slide, please? These are passages from my book, sort of exploring this. The largely unspoken truth about the Latino barrios that grew across the United States in the late 20th and early 21st centuries is that they were born of the hormonal passions and the impatience of youth. They were shaped by the willfulness and stubbornness of teenagers and young adults. Next slide, please. When our family members tell the story of their journeys from their homelands to the empire of the United States, and they will do so again and again for the rest of their lives, they will revel in their innocence, courage, and their resourcefulness. Next slide, please. They will tell of the bus ride, the crossing of the fence, the sterile modernity of the airport terminal, the encounter with a border agent, the arrival at that first apartment building in which they found posada. Posada is a Mexican Spanish word for, actually also Central American Spanish for shelter. How wonderful and frightening everything seemed in this, the adventure of their lives. Next slide, please. In their telling, they are like the heroes of fantasy stories, heading off down a road from the Shire toward Modor and Mount Doom, toward Oz or District 1, toward California and the Carolinas and other unknown lands of danger and wonder. So this passage is reflecting the idea that, we're sold empire stories as Americans, right? Those are the number one selling books and movies are fantasy stories about empire, which are really allegories about the struggles of people of color, as the great Junot Diaz put it once. Um, and also this slide here of the young man with the guitar, that's in a story one of my students wrote. One of my students described his father, leaving his town in Mexico with a guitar and getting on the road. So I thought I would include that. And so next slide, please. And so we're entering when we enter United States. When we enter the United States, we're entering United States history, right? And so that's the other part of this, is that I think we have this wonderful Latino story of youth, of traveling through empire, but then we have the tangled drama of United States history. And so here, for example, here I am. I think it's my fifth birthday. It might have been my earlier fourth birthday, 1968. East Hollywood, California. I'm the kid in the front there with the Batman hat that my mother got for me. Thank you, Mom. Um, and so on the other side of there's that wall on the left. Can I have the next slide? Um, there was an apartment building. There still is. My old duplex has been knocked down, but this apartment building is still standing. And in that apartment building, when I lived there in 1968, James Earl Ray, the assassin of Martin Luther King, also lived there. He went by the name of Ray Galt. He was escaped from a Missouri prison. And at that time, when he lived next door to me, he was planning to kill Martin Luther King in Memphis, right? In Memphis, Tennessee. So my life is inside of this drama of American history, but not just the white supremacist side. Can I have the next slide? Because also my godfather, the man who took my mother to the hospital and who met my parents in that particular duplex right there, excuse me, that particular apartment building on Madison Avenue in Hollywood, that man, the man who was my godfather, is African American, Booker Wade. And he was someone who had come to Los Angeles as a teenager because he had gotten arrested in Memphis at an NAACP youth group sit-in at the Memphis Central Library, a story that I did not learn until 40 years later. In my family, he was just the black guy who drove my mother to the hospital, right? And so my family story, right, is inside this saga of American history, inside this saga about race, right? Our story is a new chapter in the story about race. Can I have the next slide, please? So in my book, In the Migrant's Light, I'm interested in seeing the Latino experience and its place inside the larger stories of the construction of racial identities and citizenship, right? So I'm a US citizen because I was born in the United States as the son of immigrants. I have US citizenship thanks to Wong Kim Ark, a son of Chinese immigrants who was born on Sacramento Street in San Francisco, the son of Chinese immigrants, and who was thus a US citizen until federal authorities in California decided to challenge his citizenship and say, no, he's the child of immigrants. That means that he is really a subject of the empire of China. They tried to strip him of his citizenship. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in Wong Kim Ark's favor. He spent 4 months sort of in detention, essentially, in migrant detention in San Francisco Bay while this case was resolved. And the Supreme Court found in his favor. And his case is why every US born child of immigrant is a US citizen. Now, so my story is also linked with Asian American history, right? But also think about it. He wins his case thanks to the 14th Amendment, right? Which is a Reconstruction Amendment. That amendment says anyone born in the United States is a citizen and entitled to the rights thereof, which was meant to fight what the Klan was doing, right, in the South, in the Deep South during Reconstruction, right? And so our lives are very much, Latino lives are very much inserted in this story, right, of race, identity, and citizenship in the United States. Okay, the next slide, please. And so immigrant policies, right, are themselves forms of ethnic engineering. And that's part of the story too. The 1925 immigration reform that did away with the quotas for Eastern and Central Europeans, which themselves were a kind of form of racial engineering to try to keep the United States more waspy, right? That particular law is an immigration law that is, a very clear, overt form of racial engineering. Later, the 1965 immigration reform it basically created quotas for Mexican and Latin American people and created the sort of modern notion of illegal alien. So all these different laws, also the 1940s and 50s program to bring temporary migrant labor, which created the Bracero program, they've created all these different categories, right? So Latino people are inside these different liminal categories. That old black and white card, that's a Bracero ID card. The person holding that card up there, that green card, that's a permanent resident card. The other cards down the right, those are different cards given to a DACA recipient. And they say employment authorization because they're only for employment authorization. And you're still undocumented technically when you're a DACA recipient. And as a DACA recipient from Georgia told me, in Georgia, when you get a driver's license, you get a driver's license if you're a DACA recipient that says limited term. So you're not really sort of a full, you're not a full, privileged resident in terms of the eyes of the state of Georgia. That really irks a lot of people in Georgia who are DACA recipients. So we live inside these different categories that have been created by the race history of this country. Kind of the next slide, please. But as one of my students, as one of my Harvard researchers told me, who is himself a DACA recipient, we're winning the culture war. Because in spite of all of these horrible laws, in spite of this racialization of Latino people, at the grassroots level, at the community level, and especially at the working class level, there is this normalization of Latino identity. Now, these images are taken from a story from last year by the great New York Times reporter Walter Thompson Hernandez, who is himself of Black and Mexican-American heritage. He calls himself Blaxican. And these are slides of quinceañeras that have been adopted by people who are not Latino or sort of like, or just sort of on the fringes of being Latino. So here we have a Jayla Sheffield. She organizes her quinceañera and calls it a quinceañera negra, right? And that's her quinceañera negra party there. And on the left, we have Amina Sharif Hamza, right? Who is having a Muslim themed quinceañera. Right. And so there are many ways in which Latino identity is just sort of becoming part of the way of being of the country, which, of course, every ethnic group, every racial group or whatever that has sort of shaped this country, that's happened. Right. We can see throughout African-American history how African-American culture has this incredible impact on United States culture in ways that, in the relationships we have between each other, in the music we listen to, in the way we think about, justice. Right. Modern notions of justice are shaped by Black struggle, right? So next slide, please. So we're winning the culture war, as one of my students put it, but still there are these barriers. Many Latino people cannot return home. I recently had a chance to do something that, millions of Latino people literally cannot do, which is to go and see their relatives in the old country. I went to go see my mother in Guatemala. This particular photo is of her standing in front of the doorway in Guatemala City, where she met my father. It's now locked up, right? It's an old abandoned building. Only the facade of it is standing, but I was able to go back there. And I was able to close a lot of circles when I did that. I've always grown up with this sense, like a lot of Latino people do, of being sort of broken and, part of a dysfunctional family. My parents were divorced when I was very young. And, when you go back and you can close a circle, it heals you. And I was able to heal myself in that way. And a lot of Latino people cannot do that. They cannot go back. And migration is this source of hurt in them, right? And part of the message of my book is that migration is just a constant throughout human history. You go to Guatemala, there's evidence of migration in Guatemalan history. My parents are products of two different migrations from two different parts of Guatemala when they meet. Hualan, can I have the next slide? And the last slide, is the town where my father's from. This town is a town in eastern Guatemala, where many, many different groups of people have met. My father is, his mother is a Mam, Mayan Indian. There are people there in Hualan who are blue-eyed because there's a big, a European, Northern European migration to Hualan. You go to the cemetery, you see Chinese-themed tombs in the cemetery because there has always been a big Chinese migration, right? And so to me, migration is this sort of constant in human history. It predates history. Right? The human Homo sapiens defined itself as a species by leaving Africa, migrating across the globe. So part of my mission in A Migrant's Light is to tap in to my own, the light of my own memories, the light of my memory of going back to Guatemala and seeing this village that's here in this slide, this village of Hualan, and having these memories of going there when I was 4 or 5 and realizing now in my 50s that these memories have never left me, right? This story of who we are never leaves us, no matter how far we are removed, right, from these origin stories. And if that sounds far-fetched, remember the experience of the Jewish people, where this is part, of Jewish identity, is remembering the story, right? The story of the Exodus, right? Remembering the story that's commemorated in Passover. This is a story that's been remembered for thousands of years. And so I think Latino people carry the light of these memories. And that's sort of the idea, right, of my book. And I'll read this last slide here, because this is sort of the message I'm trying to communicate to my students. Our collective origin story is a million soap operas, a million Hamlets. It's a Midsummer Night's Dream, an August Wilson play, Paquita la del Barrio belting out a tune. Now, for those of you who don't know, Paquita la del Barrio is a Mexican-American singer with a really famous feminist tune called Rata de Dos Patas, about the horrible men in her life, called, Rat of 2 Feet. And of course, August Wilson, the great African-American playwright. So we have our stories are part of, these traditions. Capturing the richness of this experience is the work of our artists, and our artists are only getting started telling it, because there is a reticence in the Latino community to be fully honest about our stories, because we feel we need to protect our communities and tell only positive stories and not tell the sort of full complexities of our experience. And that's part of what my mission is in this book. And so thank you for virtually listening, and I will take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hector. Fascinating presentation indeed. We have questions, as you can imagine. The first one is about language, and the member of the audience asked, please give us a sense of the tension between English and Spanish in your experience, particularly in your writing.
Yeah, well, a lot of us grew up sort of being told we should forget our Spanish, or that Spanish was a language of backwardness. I think that's very, very much true in the 20th century, the late 20th century. And then we now Spanish is a very cool language. And so I think that a lot of people, a lot of educated Latino people, reverse assimilate into Spanish as much as they can. I went to college to learn how to write in Spanish for the first time. And then I studied abroad in Mexico, and I became fluent in Mexican Spanish and Central American Spanish and all these different sort of kinds of Spanish. So there is definitely, a tension, because, there are still people who sort of consider this a language of intimacies, right? Espanol is a language of intimacies. It's what you're supposed to speak with your family, but it shouldn't be a language you present yourself with. But now increasingly, there is just so much pride about Spanish as a language, that there is sort of, people sort of trying to keep alive Spanish traditions. There are many people too, very, not a huge amount, who study indigenous languages. You can take Nahuatl classes and Quechua classes in different parts of the United States, because there are people who are trying to embrace this indigenous aspect of their identity. And also, the term Latino erases that indigenous identity, but that's another story.
Um, Many Latinos don't like the term Latinx. What is
Yes.
your opinion on this term?
Yes, I read somewhere that only 4% of Latino people use the term Latinx, and in fact, I think something like 50 to 60% have not even heard it. And so I recently traveled across the United States doing a piece for a magazine about Latino identity, and I visited something like 30 states. And I didn't encounter anybody on a sort of street level who used the term Latinx. And in fact, one person in Miami got very offended when, in an exchange of emails, myself and my assistant, we used the term Latinx, and she got very offended. I think it's a term that is that is represents a new spirit. It represents this idea that the old, it's kind of a critique of the gender roles in Latino culture, in Latinx culture. Absolutely, it's a critique. Um, I wonder how deep this critique will go. Chicano started off as a university, movement type term, and eventually, worked its way into the working class. I think, these things are fluid. As you saw in my presentation, there have been all these different terms over the years. They've been very, very fluid. People's idea of ethnic identity is very fluid. I think the jury is still out on how accepted Latinx will become.
Mhm. The next question is, can you speak about the American dream, since that is what often pulls Latino immigrants in the US, even while they may be fleeing conditions in their home countries? Do Latino people have to become white to achieve the American dream? That's a good question.
I think that in the 20th century, there was this notion that we definitely we had to assimilate into whiteness. And as you saw in some of my slides, it's sort of a theme in Latino history. I think that, and also in terms of the American dream, yes, absolutely. I think especially in the late 20th century, the mid 20th century, you were coming to the United States at the height of its economic power. If you migrated to the United States, economic and cultural power, and so there was incredible draw to the United States as this sort of symbol of, you know, of modernity, right? That's changed a great deal, right? The sort of the shine of the United States has diminished a great deal in the eyes of the world. But people, still definitely migrate for economic reasons. And I think also what it means to be American has really shifted so much, thanks to the struggles of all different kinds of people of color, right? The African American political and cultural struggles have really influenced Latino identity, and you see that really at the level of young people and families. Just I remember going out during the George Floyd protests and seeing spontaneous groups of Latino and Black young people, just taking over the streets together in places where there were no television cameras, just sort of, random corners of South Los Angeles and even West Los Angeles. And it was just part of this sort of organic, encounter between these two incredible traditions, that of Latin American class struggle and African American struggle for justice. And so I think that, what it means to be American is constantly shifting, and I can see that shifting in the way Latinos approach the American dream.
Mm. I just wanted to point out that there are many comments of praise and gratitude for your talk and for your teaching, research and writing. One of them also has a question and says, I absolutely love your project. And I have a question about whether or not your project's title is also influenced by Albert Camus,
Oh,
perhaps by the way of Frantz Fanon's affinity for Camus.
well, absolutely. I think that many of there are many different peoples and nations that have dealt with these questions of identity, these questions of the human being, right? You know, um, in a colonial setting, right? Camus himself is a child of empire, right? He is, born and raised in French Algeria. Later, as a French writer, witnesses, the beginnings of the Algerian uprising. And so, yes, wanting to sort of approach this subject with intellectual depth, with thinking not only what it says about my own particular experience, but what can we say about the human experience, right? By reflecting on the Latino experience. And to me, this is an opportunity to reflect on the race history of the United States and to add something to that discussion, right? I think very often we approach ethnic questions in our channels. This is a Latino question. This is a Black question. This is an Asian question. But really, I really believe in that sort of philosophical, whole approach of looking at the entire situation and understanding what it does to our souls. Absolutely.
Yeah, the next question, do you find a difference in origin stories and identity in those whose family were in Texas or New Mexico before statehood?
Well, absolutely. I just took this incredible journey across the United States, and I traveled very quickly through New Mexico. And, I met a guy who, he's like, I don't know how long we've been here. And he's like, yeah, I'm supposedly on my tata side, my grandfather's side. And we go back, I don't know how far. And I looked at, his surname up, and it's Basque. His surname is Basque. And there was someone with that surname who was the leader of a small Spanish expedition in the 1700s. And so people in New Mexico have this, very, very different sense of what Hispanic identity is. And also Hispanic is the term that's used mostly in New Mexico. So those stories those crossing stories, are just so different. And there's people, and I have many students who actually did the crossing. They have memories of being a child, in that crossing. And so, it's always it's a question of empire shifting, and some of us have lived that in the flesh in our time, and others, we have the story that goes back 4 or 5 centuries.
Um, One more question. Could you talk about migration and forced migration, such as migration from civil wars in Central America?
Yeah, I mean, it's undoubted that there is an incredible amount of violence behind Latino migration today. There's, first of all, the violence that takes place, in our native countries, or in the old country, right? Um, Guatemala's violence begins in 1954 with this coup, lasts through 30 years of military governments, in which basically a group of thugs, a gang of thugs, military thugs, was in charge of the country. And they, they instituted this regime of terror. And that has continued up into the present now, where we have a very weak state that's dominated by cartels, right? And the cartels have dominated the power of the state so much that there is no rule. The rule of law is very weak, and so people live in a state of precariousness. So there's that violence that forces people to leave, and then there's the violence of the crossing itself, right? Because thanks to this wall, and I didn't even go into this, that wall that was built, right, between first in San Isidro, and later, in parts of El Paso, and now through the Arizona border, it's forced people to take these routes in the desert that are murderous. Every year, dozens, if not hundreds, of people die in the desert, and their remains are turned into bones. It's an erasure, really. Their physical, the physical, proof of their existence is being erased by the sun, by these forces, these natural forces in the desert, and that's an incredibly violent process. If you pay for a smuggler as you're crossing, that smuggler is going to charge you, these exorbitant fees, and then more likely than not will hold you hostage and torture you, right? That has become a feature of this process. And to me, that's extremely disturbing. And that's part now of the American story, right? Part of the American story is that we have millions of people living among us who are connected to a story of torture, of deprivation, right? Um, and that cannot be a good thing for American democracy, and especially if we keep so many people in this liminal status that effectively transforms them into a social caste, right? A social caste who work among us but don't have the privileges of United States citizenship, right? So it's a very, very troubling moment. But at the same time, there is just this incredible fortitude. In my journey across the United States recently, I met undocumented people who are, own homes and have college degrees and are painting murals in public places and just doing incredible things. And so, on the other side of this violence is this fortitude that is part of just, of the human experience of these people. So that makes me that part of the equation makes me very optimistic.
Thank you, Hector. Thank you so much. Thank you for your thoughtful presentation and your perspectives. I also want to thank our audience for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. And with that, I thank you again for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day.